Hello, my name is Rebekah Coffman, and I'm here for the Religion, Art, and Technology Lab for our new series, Tangible, Intangible. And I am very excited to be joined today by Ashley, who's an architect, historian, preservationist, many, many things. And she's going to be talking to me today about her project called 3D Camino. So thank you, Ashley.
Hi, Rebecca. It's been nice actually to be able to go back to this because we started all of this together in thesis here in London. So it's a nice way to return to it.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so thrilled to be able to talk about your project because since I knew of it, I've absolutely loved it. Maybe before we get into the specifics of the project, you can tell us a little bit about you, kind of what your interest in this theme of like pilgrimage and documentation and heritage has been.
Yeah. I mean, since I started graduate program with you in NYU, I beforehand have done the Camino de Santiago a few times in Spain, and so it's kind of stuck with me, even though I'm an architect in training and I studied for history, and then I also am now working within sustainable architecture. It's been kind of still like a part of me that I continue to use. And I'm very much in flux as well with what I do, because it does involve a lot of those few things that I just talked about. What it's not specifically on the Camino, but a lot of architecture, a bit of history actually right now, but then also my other hobby, I guess you can say, which is technology. I never really went into tech at all, but it kind of was something I had to use for work. So I think at work right now, currently, I'm an architectural technologist. That's the best way to put it.
That sounds very
Yeah.
official.
It's
Architectural
super.
technologist.
So does historian though. So I don't like to call myself a historian because
Right.
you can always find like some amazing people that don't have the title and they know everything about one topic.
Titles are just titles.
Right.
No, but I mean, the combination of all those things, right? Because
Yeah.
for you, you have this professional skill set that you've acquired through architectural training, through studies of history, if you don't want the title. But you've also undergone this process as a pilgrim, which is a really interesting mix, right? Like how was that experience for you, or how did you kind of select to do the Camino?
I mean, I graduated from RISD, which is a design art school. So I wanted kind of to have my my final graduation gift to myself as a solo trip, and I chose the Camino because my parents did it. I heard really great things about it, and I lived in Spain for a little bit, and I just decided it was the time. Also, it was a good time for reflection after such a big phase of your life is finished. So no, that's how I ended up doing it, and then I returned to it every so often. And in pieces. I didn't do the full thing when I returned to it, but in the end, it just kind of mixed. It was an excuse to mix my interests, and when I ended up having to do a thesis, I went with it. Even though a lot of the thesis work was personal work I just did on the side when I was doing my first job in New York. So I keep adding to it, and it's really nice to actually see sometimes when people, mainly historians, have their own blogs on the site. So their ideas on what they return to in history kind of make me create more projects off of my initial idea. Yeah.
I love that. I guess maybe we should start turning toward the project so you can introduce it a little more formally
Sure.
for us. But I mean, as you're kind of pulling that up, maybe we can just say, the concept of the project is a combination of this documentation of pilgrimage in lots of different ways, right? It's not just about saying, oh, these are the places you stop. It's also, it is bringing in that architecture and talking about place and geography and the technology component, like you were saying. How do you document place? How do you document process? And the actual ritual or experience of the ritual, not just a photo of the exterior or something. Which I think all those layers are really great.
What's also super fascinating about the Camino is how you document memory, because the whole thing, the whole it's a passage, and it's a passage of experience. And that's what's the most fascinating thing about it, because it is history through experience. And I think that's why I've always been so intrigued by it and returned to it. And I think now, as we, modernize how we show history, it becomes even more interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But yeah, I guess with that, do you want to show us some of your examples, or walk us through kind of your process?
Let me see if I can share my screen properly. Correct screen. Yeah. Okay. All right. Are you able to see this?
I see you.
Okay, let me see. Oh, display didn't swap. Okay. So you see where my pointer is, I think?
Yeah.
There's a video. Okay.
Yep.
So I'm actually going to start off with a video of a blog I found of a historian that took videos and photos of while he was on the Camino. And I thought it was so interesting because for me, these different shots are multiple interpretations that represent a historical journey spanning over 1,000 years. Like everyone that has passed through the Camino has seen to some extent these places that he's capturing, but in also many ways, it doesn't really capture the full experience of what it means to take that pilgrimage. But every unique story, this is what makes also the Camino so interesting. Every unique story becomes part of the Camino de Santiago's purpose. It's a pilgrimage to walk to the tomb of St. James, but at the same time, it's the individual duty to walk there that makes the journey only understood by those who complete it. So to this day, I believe that is part of the reason why it has a continuous relevance. It overlays all the personal journeys of struggle, loss, joys, and discoveries that you eventually find towards getting to a common destination. For many reasons, this is why I consider it a timeless artifact. It's branded through this continuous use and remembrances of its pilgrims' journeys, and it's one of the few artifacts that I know of where its tangible spirit outlines tangible memories. And for me, that's through these sculptures or just through the plants that you see and whatever lasts through so long. I'm just, before I go into like my project, I'd like to go into how into a brief background of the Camino of Santiago. So it's after St. James. So St. James was a fisherman called by Jesus from his nets at the Sea of Galilee. So he became one of his 12 followers, and probably along with his brother John as well. According to legend, though, when James was killed by Herod's soldiers, the body was brought on a boat to Galicia, and miraculously it was rediscovered in the 19th century in Santiago, as foretold in Charlemagne's vision of the saint's tomb being found there at the end of the earth, or Finisterre. On the left-hand side is Mappa Mundi. They have many of these throughout the Middle Ages, especially. It's not geographically correct. It's not meant for that purpose, but it's meant to kind of represent where the end of the earth, well, in some, where the end of the earth is located, and also it can have specific relevance to certain pilgrimages. And this specific one, it actually mentions and shows a little bit about the pilgrimage of the Camino. And then on the right-hand side is the Apostle St. James. And in the end, this pilgrimage, it was like a useful champion for the reconquest of the peninsula of Spain from the Islamic incomer. And the cult of Santiago of Compostela really came from that. And in the end, through time, I would say that the Camino it was used for many different things. It was political, you traded a lot, but everyone had their own expression of arriving to the tomb of St. James. Everyone had their own guides. The oldest guide is on the left-hand side, and it gave different introductions to how pilgrim needed to travel, how also they needed certain essentials. I liked some of them where it says two bags, one very full of patience and the other one containing a certain amount of money. But and then on the right hand side we have our modern, like most popular Camino de Santiago guide that normally you see pilgrims with, depending on the version that they have. But in the end, I would say that as a pilgrim of the Camino, I always return to this question of, it's so, I mean, and also studying it as well, it's so fascinating, these different interpretations of journey. Authentically describes that experience, or it's mainly through their form of experience, and you see it through these different manners of each pilgrim trying to arrive to the tomb of St. James. It's, for me, it's fairly fascinating in that sense, and you see different depictions of that from Middle Ages as that first Pilgrim's Guide text, as certain paintings, as well as when you're on the Camino on the right hand side, it's also a text from an old writer, but you still see it when you walk, or they try to add art exhibitions and installations while you're on the Camino that kind of talks about its past. But I always looked at those interpretations through my own, obviously, background, through my experience in art, mainly also through preservation work, because that's what I've always done, and then also through technology, because that was my hobby. I saw this journey through the designs that I worked with colleagues in preservation, and then the way that they use centuries old crafts. For me, it's incredible how some places have been restored. So I always then try to capture it in certain ways with tech, through scanning. I mean, photos is the most basic, but trying to use photos as for scanning. So for me, authenticity was always in the spirit of the art, and then technology became a form of its representation. So I used always technology as a tool to aid that process of really finding out what made the Camino intangible, or give it some sort of spirit, or to at least provide a form to represent it. Right. I go back to what, in the end, ICOMOS really talked about when they first described what intangible was, and they regarded, or they gave certain recommendations and principles to preserving the spirit of a place, and the safeguarding of what tangible and intangible heritage is. And they regarded it as like an innovative and efficient manner of ensuring sustainable and social development through the world. And it recognized that the spirit of the place is made up of tangible as well as intangible elements, all significantly contributing to the place that gives, obviously, its spirit. And for them, spirit is defined by the tangible buildings and sites and roots and objects, and the intangible elements are the memories and the narratives and the written documents, which goes a lot to what I was initially describing with the pilgrim guides, because it's all to say that this physical route that we're going on, it's really described by all of these different texts. Like, how do you put those things together? How do you give that some sort of meaning, especially if somebody hasn't gone through the journey? Right. So, I mean, with this Comos Declaration in Quebec, they really talked about not separating the spirit from the place, and not considering them opposing to each other. It's mainly about investigating ways on how the two can interact and mutually construct one another, and considering as well the way of giving possibly like different definitions to what is tangible or intangible, giving a more comprehensive understanding of intangible by something really tangible. And that can be a little bit fluid, but for me, that the best way that I could see that was through technology. So in the end, I made a few examples when I was on the Camino. The Camino crosses 184 cities. It's over 1,500 kilometers long. And in the end, like I was saying, it was one of the highest forms of authority in the Middle Ages as well, to like conquer land, and also agriculture at the time was sparse. The pilgrimage routes like went through a lot of areas, and it was used for trade and population and diplomatic ties. But it was also a form of unity. So it's very interesting when you go through the route, when you go through the Camino, the similarities to get to the end of the world, which is over here in Finisterre, all the way at the end. But I really love the beginning because it kind of has some mystery to it. A lot of routes as well cross into each other, and that's also the most important thing about the Camino, the physical route. And so they've always kept a lot of their architectural heritage as well. And it's actually, I think, the most complete physical registry of Christian architectural heritage of a pilgrimage to date. So that really gives almost like a really look back in time, especially when you're entering from France into Spain. You see cultures very much mix. And so the Camino to me really raised interesting points of heritage protection, especially after thinking about really like, how do you preserve a heritage journey, a journey in general? How do you preserve or try to conserve like an authentic essence of that pilgrimage, and where it's not so far in the past and not even, but still alive? I mean, it's very interesting to see how people reframe it, especially to this day. So I kind of tried to do that with two examples, and one is called Restoration of Belief and the other is Stories as Digital Records. And mainly one goes into a little bit of detail with an ornament and the other one is more based on a site. So I tried to study these experiences through like a very I would say tried to really study the intangible significance of the Camino by using very tangible case studies that use emerging technologies rooted in preservation values. I tried to test this mainly through these two case studies that mix traditional restoration techniques with modern technology. So they're mainly experiments of modern technology's role in aiding historic construction and design methods that have been successful for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Because in the end, these are just the leftovers of amazing pieces of history. So I'm gonna probably just go through my website to show you a little bit about these two things, because I recorded it there mainly for thesis purposes, but I kept adding to it over time too. It was never just for thesis as well, because the thesis just made me organize it a little bit more.
It's great how it does that, right?
I know.
Having a deadline.
Having a deadline is super important. It's super important. So over here, I think I'm just going to start with Restoration of the Leaf.
Yeah.
So this first one, it's the second, it's the further one down on the map. I would have to show it to you again. But I mainly wanted to go about this ornament that I found in an abbey. Yes, in an abbey. I'm pretty sure it's an abbey. Yes, and in an abbey. No, in a monastery. Excuse me. Yes, yeah, and yes, in the monastery, because I was in the cloisters. I didn't remember if it was an abbey or if it was the monastery. But this one monastery that I found in Nájera, it was actually really beautiful, because you start seeing as well how certain saints, they depending on certain times of who was in power, they would obviously take away some of the figures of power in each of the monasteries or abbeys. So you would see some corbels damaged, you would see as well some statues without heads, and that was pretty typical depending on the area, and actually depending on the religious power in place, whoever took over. But in the end, I kind of was looking at this monastery through just the simple ornamentation that did survive. And then if I could start with something very simple that was damaged, maybe it could lead to something else like a saint or a statue later on, but that would require a little bit more historical evidence in order to totally recreate that. But I wanted to approach this through a non-invasive means. I'm very used to, with the work that I used to do, make restoration documents on how to take a previously found ornamental fascia, for example, and make a cast mold of it, and then make the final product of its replica.
Sure.
So in the end, I just wanted to do that simply though with a corbel that had a damaged leaf. Mainly, in my previous jobs in New York, I worked in restoration, so we would always look at making something new from scratch, looking at historical evidence, and then seeing how we can recreate it. And we would draw it from scratch. So sometimes it's not really used on what is existing. Sometimes it is in these forms where you do have something existing and you can take it back and either bring back the color depending on what you actually have there. But sometimes you have to make it up because there's sometimes ornaments that you just don't see, and you have to go back to historical records to see what would fit for that that space and that time period. And so for here, I just wanted to start with something small, like a leaf. So part of my technology was I scanned a lot. I mainly did that through photos. I did photogrammetry. I took a lot of photos of damaged works, and I tried to take the photos together to then recreate it accurately in a 3D digital space. And then from there, I would then create a model of it. And the model really helped with understanding what are the details of the damage that we have. And then it also allowed me to kind of get an idea of what areas can I build off of. So that recreation that I was talking about, like it was a reference that I could use to then go back and restore that one leaf because I had a few others. So I looked back and analyzed what I could see in person and then also through the 3D, because I did want to be non-invasive. So for me, it was very important to not touch the original artifact because that is what it's there. But if I ever did want to go back and let's say do a recreation of it, I could. But I think it's also nice to have the time show what was taken away and what wasn't. But non-invasive was also important because it kind of can help as well with how the restoration process can be completed. Because if you have to actually restore the actual piece itself, it could be more expensive. It could be actually really damaging to the site. So it was also through practicality that I was thinking in this way. So I did do the scan. I was able to then make a 3D print out of plastic for this a replica. So I did it at a quarter scale and I replicated it to then see how I can make a restoration by hand and then as well through digital restoration. So what I mean by that is I don't have, actually, do I have a good picture here? I'll just show you through my, I have a photo as well. So I first started out with making it through clay.
Sure.
By adding in this extra leaf. And then this photo here actually shows the digital restoration that I did. So I did a 3D model of it online, and then I recreated it digitally. So I could then see if the digital would compare with my clay. So I did one on the computer so that I could then print it and then compare and contrast. But then this one as well, I did one by hand so that I can then create a mold of it. And I kind of like the idea more, I went more with the mold with the clay because that means anybody else can do it. The digital would require me to know the technology in order for me, I would need to know two things. I would need to know the technology in order to recreate it digitally, this leaf. And then second, I would have to be trained fairly well on the technology and as well on the curvature of the leaf, the restoration of the leaf. what
Right.
basically I'm doing here with the clay, I would need to do that process fairly professionally as well in the 3D um, program. So it
Right.
requires two skills. Whereas here I have the one skill as a digital technologist. I can print
Mm-hmm.
out the 3D replica, and then I can
Mm-hmm.
pass it on to a professional artisan
Mm-hmm.
that has been trained in creating these types of corables for a long time as it's been
Right.
passed down, and then they can do it themselves. So I
Yeah.
I did I did two to kind of test it, but I did want to stick with this one because
Mm-hmm.
in the end 3D can do a lot, but it can't actually give the touch of a human hand, especially of
Mm.
artisans.
Mm-hmm.
So I went through with that, and then also went through after adding the clay, and then also getting feedback from some of my former colleagues at
Mm-hmm.
work. They gave me not just ideas, but then they also really gave me the process of how you do a historical mold of
Sure.
these of plaster mold, and it goes down the line as well with traditions in certain areas of the world. So Larissa is from Russia, and she
Mm.
learned it from a school in Russia, and it was passed down. It's been passed down for many generations, this
Hmm.
plaster technique. So that was also a reason why I wanted to keep, because I knew how from the work that I've done, I knew that the tradition of craft really came through a lot of experience, a lot of teaching, and really
Right.
honestly a lot of generations of artisans. So it's trying to create also a collaboration between
Mm-hmm.
technology and the artisan of
Mm-hmm.
today, that
Mm-hmm.
they work together, because technology, yes, can do so much and can record it, but it can't really give that same art
Right.
that, well, at least I believe that can't give that feel of a painter or of an artist in the end. And also it's really nice to know that they still exist and their trade is
Right.
still really well respected. So in the end, we actually made a clay, um, yeah, final clay
Mm-hmm.
replica of the corbel.
Mm-hmm.
So it might not be of the same material, which is stone, but
Yeah.
there are different methods as well to 3D printing where it can be
Mm-hmm.
made of stone, but also when you already make a plaster mold, you can make molds of fairly anything if the mold is
Mm-hmm.
good enough.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully it gives some sort of, for me at least, it gave me some sort of idea, okay, if this works, at least now, then maybe it can lead on to something else.
Mm-hmm.
I tried using this mold as well with recycled metal.
Mm.
And it did work. It wasn't super fine, but I'm
Okay.
pretty sure that there should be a process of that.
Hmm.
I think I have photos. I do have photos of that.
Hmm.
But in the end, it was a really interesting process because I really tried to go about seeing how the mold could be used in different ways, and
Mm-hmm.
how as well we can be using artisan expertise on this, because it's super important.
Well, and
But
I really love that it is like that perfect marriage of high tech, low tech, where it is you could go as elaborately as this complete digital rendering for restoration. And then I think, like you said, like the touch of the artisan is still something that's completely irreplaceable, no matter what we do with technology. Like there's just, I mean, going to intangible, but there's this intangible quality of knowing a human made something that you can just tell. You can just tell the difference.
yeah,
Um, which is really beautiful. And then you have like this really complex kind of like spatial temporal thing where it's, the way that you're interacting with these 11th century, 12th century architectural features that, both respects the time. Like you said, showing that age, showing that time is important to the story, but then also being able to have your own conversation with it in this restoration process is really cool.
yeah, I mean, in the end, it's not just about the recording, is only goes so far, because it's my
Hmm.
experience of how I saw it in that one moment too.
Yeah.
So the artist that actually has all of the experience historically on how to restore the leaf, I think it just adds to the moment in time of doing
Yeah.
a comparison to what you have
Yeah.
seen and then to what you can do now. I really, I also, like you, I also think that the touch is super important.
Yeah.
But I hope also with how we show history, it's very much I guess I hope that it's always shown as the different side by sides, but without
Mm.
being super intrusive on one or the other. So
Mhm.
that's why I kind of always looked at how I approach things as very moderated
Mm.
on either end, because I
Mhm.
don't want it to be too intrusive on either the tool or just the memory. It's supposed to represent maybe even a little bit of thought when
Yeah.
when you do a bit of comparison.
Yeah. I love
Yeah.
it.
Um,
You do have one other example you want to show us too, right?
I do.
Okay.
So let me go to the top. And then
I
the
mean, it's great
second
because
one,
it's so specific. You're like, it's a leaf, but also it is the entire story of pilgrimage at the
I
same
mean,
time.
in
Yeah.
the end, it was for me, it was my interpretation of what I saw on the pilgrimage. And
Hmm.
it is, I mean, can be used for other parts of the pilgrimage as well. It doesn't
Right.
just have to be for the corbel, but it has, for me, I think the potential of how we restore and how we conserve should be pushed. It should be
Mm.
challenged
Hmm.
to be not so intrusive, and also give, I think it becomes even more responsible to make it sustainable in the way of, if you're going to be promoting culture and
Hmm.
promoting the history, the spirit of a place, you better as well promote the artisan culture, the generational education of that one area. And
Hmm.
if you do have the technology that is modernizing, you can also provide that to whomever the site belongs to,
Yeah.
if they know the local art better than I do, which I'm really sure that they do. The second example that I have is mainly on photos. It goes
Hmm.
back to as well the photogrammetry technology that
Hmm.
I was talking to you about. But
Hmm.
photogrammetry also just comes out of as simple as photos. It's,
Hmm.
I like to say to people, you just need to take a good photo. You need to learn how to take good photos. And it's
Right.
surprising actually how people just don't, but it's also for a certain purpose. If you take good photos
Hmm.
in a certain way, it comes out and and in a great form for 3D. So what I did for this case study is for a little small chapel called Onate. It used to be called Onate, which is the good port. It signifies
Mm.
basically the good door, or the place to be, the door
Mm.
to enter. It also, yeah, as I mentioned, I actually hear the well-born. So in
Mm.
the end, actually, it's in a very close proximity to the start of the Camino
Hmm.
when you're entering. It's a little off course, which makes the site also really interesting because it's part of the pilgrimage, but not really. And it was probably used by the Templars. We're not
Mm.
100% sure, but the way that it was designed really kind of gives an idea that it was of the Templar architecture.
Mm.
So it's also a really fascinating site, because through photos that I looked through after being on the site and after taking my own photos, it
Mhm.
actually was a burial ground as well.
Mm.
So it, as you can see here in the octagonal area on the
Mhm.
outside of the church, it was they buried what they think were Templar
Hmm.
knights. We're not sure. Um, to this day, we're not 100% sure, but that is kind of the mystery of it. And actually, it's fascinating because when you go there, you see also the spacing is a little bit different. The height of the area is a little bit different, and
Mhm.
all of it is is interesting to go back to when you see it in person. I should actually, let's see if I have modern photos of it. But in the end, this is the one modern photo that I have. I can look up for other ones that I have on my drive. But in the end, it's actually very interesting to see the site of how it is and then relook at the old photos. So what I ended up doing was I took old photos and my own photos, and I tried to place them together in order to create a 3D reconstruction of the site. So if you do have a timeline of history, especially of the photos being in specific areas, if they are in the same place, if you take the right photos, then you can join them together to create a digital model. So that's what I tried to do with this one. It's not as thorough as the Leaf case study, but I did make a model trying to show the internal area based on the photos that I took, but then also on the photos that I ended up seeing historically. So the symbology of it, everything that I was able to see, I could also kind of contrast it to the historical photos that I had to search for. So it's not as intrusive, or it's not as thorough as the other one, but it really required me to look through a lot of photos. I should probably have a little bit more process on this than as I do on the other one. But I looked through a lot of photos in order to be able to see whether or not the angles were correct. So when I make the 3D model, it goes through a lot of trial and error, because you can't really make a 3D model that doesn't have overlapping images. So I tried to see if it works, and the internal was how I tried to recreate the space through a mix of time. But it would be fascinating if in the past they had more photos internally, and you can create a 3D reconstruction on historical photos, which would be amazing. That would be really, really cool, which we obviously will have in the future for our generation. But in the past, that would be amazing if they had, even in the 20th century. So
well, and it's just so interesting, this idea of using the modern representation, conflating it with the historic, and just like you said, really piecing together what its history is in this way that doesn't exist historically or even in the present, because what you created is like this third space between, which is really, really great. And within it, you also have like these points, right, that help you kind of explore the different elements of its history.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, it's also, it is creating almost like a third world of the space. I wish there was more of a way to, I would have to really go further in depth, I guess, with like virtual reality to kind of describe the two differences by seeing it in person. But it's also really cool if you, I think it would be very interesting if you're in the space and you see how a digital, or even just how a reconstruction of it looks like by meshing all of the historical artifacts that you find. But when you're in the space and then you see it, if you even have a photo, because I think it takes away as well being in a space and experiencing a space, but seeing maybe a photo or just having some sort of object next to what you're seeing, having a comparison is I guess it's where I put importance.
Yeah, well, it does. It gives that kind of ability for you, without visiting the site yourself, to have this understanding of its history, because you are presenting it in this way that, like I said, like this doesn't exist in this way if you were to visit the site. So it creates this, like ability to experience pilgrimage in a totally different way, from the comfort of your own home, or however you want to share it.
No, and I no, I agree. I mean, in the end, I think pilgrimage, I think pilgrimage routes bring a lot of personal experience to places. So some people also really focus on the architectural, some people really focus on the spirituality, I guess, of the route. But that I think is also what will give people, this is what gives me insight too to the Camino. I see so many blogs where people talk specifically about this one area that they really find interesting, being at home and seeing that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the comparison for me, I wish they had a little bit more of in general with some places. But yeah, that's the cool thing about being from home. You can see so many different things from one place
Mm-hmm.
and compare it.
Mm-hmm.
But,
Wow.
yeah.
I mean, fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing it with us,
Yeah.
with me. And
Yeah, no problem.
yeah, I think this just creates this really, well, like I said, kind of complex layering in a way that's also really accessible, where it is something you're saying, anyone can take photos. We all have our own
Yeah.
ways of documenting history, and there are ways we can preserve it, high tech and low tech. And there are ways that we can express kind of our version or experience of that thing within all of it.
Yeah.
Maybe
You
with the
know,
help of somebody like you to model it, but
no, but this is also the thing. I mean, it
yeah,
requires a collaboration between one
yeah,
expertise and another, because I would say that I'm not really an expert in one thing. I kind of like have the hobby in a bit of fields that then have created a profession. I feel really lucky to say that, because right now I basically have to add all of these things together for what I do. But it requires that collaboration, which
yeah,
is, I hope, never goes away to create history, or at least create a record for history. I mean, I
yeah,
test it out just because I'm interested in two fields, but it creates, I think, a little bit more color when you have two experts working in the same project. It gives a
yeah.
little bit more perspective. That comparison is important.
I agree. Well, I mean, to your point, I think each person will bring a different version of the story in
Yeah,
addition to their personal expertise, professional expertise. It's just the more collaboration, the richer it will be, and
exactly. Yeah,
that's a beautiful thing.
yeah.
All right. Well, I'm going to say thank you because I recognize we are probably at time, but thank you so much for your time and for sharing this with us.
No, no problem. No, thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate it. I hope you guys find it interesting. I mean, I have other examples as well of
Mm-hmm.
the Camino over here. I have
Yes.
a few others as well that I've done a little bit more in-depth work in, but they all really go about in a background of
Mm-hmm.
preservation and just, I guess, a different, and mainly in non-intrusive forms of restoration. But
Yeah.
no, I feel
Yeah.
really honored as well to be asked to show work of an interest.
Well, good. Thank you. And yes, people go check the website. There's a lot there.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you, Ashley.
All right, really appreciate it. Bye, Rebecca.